Two raiders plumb the depths of their experience to make sense of a world gone completely insane. Subscribe for the word. Like and leave a comment. Stranger by the Hour.
All right, welcome back to Stranger by the Hour, everybody. Today we have Brad Miller returning to us for another awesome talk. We talked to Brad a little over a year ago, right? Aaron and I were both in San Diego at the time doing some work with the SEALs. And you know what? I don't recall exactly how we got on your radar. I think just friends of friends on Instagram. And it's always good finding people who share a worldview. I liken it to Plato's cave, where you're chained to the floor and you've decided that these are just moving shapes on the wall, and so you're looking around. And you're like, man, is there anybody else that sees this shit? And it's always good when you see like another set of eyes looking around. You're like, oh, okay, right there, that dude sees it too. How do I wiggle over in my chains and get closer to that dude and be like, hey, man, these are fucking images on the wall. How do we get out of here? So I'm super happy to have Brad back on the show. And I'd love to keep this rolling, but Brad, how you been doing, man? What are you up to now?
Hey, thanks so much for inviting me back. Really appreciate it. What you guys do is great. Happy to have another conversation with you. And in fact, over the past 2 years or so, I've done a lot of interviews. I don't know how many, but a lot. And whenever people ask me, hey, what are some of your favorite interviews that you've done? And I have to assume I've done over 100. But the previous one that I did with you guys is one of the ones that I always point people to, depending on kind of if they're ready for that or kind of what they're looking for. But but that was one of the favorite conversations that I've had. And I'll tell you why real quick. So, a lot of people came to me and they wanted to talk to me about why I left the military, et cetera, et cetera. And depending on who that person was or the context of the discussion, sometimes the interview would be very narrowly focused, but I always enjoyed the times where I could speak to people at length in a more kind of longer form conversation, as opposed to something that's just a very short news item or something. But then also it's great to be able to talk to people where you can kind of talk about much bigger picture items, like, hey, well, how does this play into the much bigger picture of what's going on? And unfortunately, there are still many people out there who I think don't really have a grasp of what's happening in the big picture sense.
Yeah, I concur, man. I can't stand like restricted conversations. So when I find myself in like a small talk environment and I realize that I'm within a very limited scope of where this conversation can go, I very quickly lose interest.
Sure.
And that kind of leads me to the last video that you put out on your website or your YouTube, and I'll link it down in the description of everywhere we post this, which is Geopolitics 101. And the way that you had labeled Geopolitics 101 was essentially the normie view of reality, for lack of a better term. And whenever I find myself in those conversations, it's very limited. So since typically the people you're talking to who have that worldview, they can't onboard things like you've discussed in that last video, which was, the potential role of secret societies, the potential role of wealth that is not centuries old, but perhaps wealth that might be millennia old. What does that type of mindset look like? And for people that aren't ready to start looking at those possibilities, I'm just like, look, man, I gotta go talk to somebody else for a little bit. Hey, it was good talking to you. I gotta go over here and just I find it sometimes better to either just be by myself, or find people that can actually discuss these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And the issue that we run into a lot of times is, take someone that who is exceptionally well read, but in the normie narrative, or take somebody that has a PhD in history. And so therefore they know a lot. I'm not saying they're not smart, but the problem is that, you know a lot of stuff that's not necessarily an accurate depiction of the way things really are. And so therefore this individual may have an inflated sense of what exactly they know. So anyway, and the reason why I kind of called it Geopolitics 101 was because Hey, listen, even if you are highly studied, but within the normie narrative, you're not here, you're here. And you know a lot of stuff that is going to send you in the wrong direction because you're going to miss things that are happening, and you are not going to be able to understand the significance of other things that are happening.
You know, it's interesting. I just forgot the fake or the language that you would likened it to, but you know, it's like being an expert in a fake language. You know, I look back at portions of my life. You know, I got a lot of time up here when I'm actually on the farm farming to just sit and think about things, and I think that's one of the things that are missing in a lot of people's lives is just the ability to just like run down thought paths for an hour or two. You know, and I look back and to reinforce the way you worded it is, so when I was a kid, you know, video games weren't great. So I was playing Dungeons and Dragons with some friends, right? And so there's different worlds in Dungeons and Dragons, and Dungeons and Dragons is essentially how I refer to the world nowadays. You know, you can become a master of the lore of a certain world in Dungeons and Dragons, where you know the history. We'll just say The Hobbit, for example. You know, you're playing a fantasy role-playing game called The Hobbit. You know everything about Middle Earth. You know the history, and all that shit is fake. Like it's literally sort of the same thing in reality. Not to say that all of history is fake, but it's clearly adulterated. It's clearly doctored. It's clearly written from the winner's perspective. And there's clearly been times where we have lost mass chunks of data for various reasons, you know, man-made disasters, natural disasters. So and when you try to discuss the actual state of events with people who are tied to the geopolitical 101 reality, it's like they can't, it's almost like they don't want to, it's not that they don't want to see it, but from my perspective, it's almost like they can't see it. Like it's a strange metaphysical phenomenon almost.
Yeah,
you know,
I would agree with you. Yeah. Yeah. And I'll tell you this, here's another thing too. So I think, you know, you guys, me, so guys who spent a long time in the military, the truth of that is that your eyes are opened in some regard, but in other ways, it's much harder if you spent a lot of time in the military to break out of that geopolitics 101 view. I'm sure, you know, you guys know this, you know, I've seen it, but just think about it. If you spend 2 decades of your adult life operating in a way that kind of forces you to look at the world through that geopolitics 101 lens, it is just going to be that much harder to kind of break out of that, because you're kind of, and we've all been there. You know, sometimes you can almost kind of go through your military career almost in a state of cognitive dissonance, because it's, well, hey, you know, I know I'm being told this, and I know I'm being told that U.S. foreign policy objectives are X, Y, and Z, and that's why we're participating in this, you know, military activity or this deployment that is part of this ongoing, you know, global war on terror or whatever, right? But you're inside that system that kind of reinforces that geopolitics 101 view, or that reinforces that, hey, you know, we as in Americans, you know, have to do these actions for these reasons, blah, blah, blah. And sure, there may be some corruption, you know, but, you know, mostly on the Democrat side, though, you know, blah, blah, blah. And anyway, you know, you get these guys who just have these views that just kind of reinforce that normie narrative when you're like, man, come on, guys, like there's more going on here.
One of the biggest copiums, or like the biggest cope things that I hear, because I consider it a personal failing, but I took a contract working with the military again because farm equipment costs money. And, you know, my exit strategy is to farm my way out of this thing. But so working with the military again, you know, I took a 3-year hiatus from 2021. We were doing that thing with the SEALs when we talked last year. So that was just like a little episodic thing. But this is the first time I've been like back at a headquarters for like, you know, week in, week out.
Yeah.
And I'm I do my best to keep quiet, but I can't, because I've got more combat experience than most of the people I'm standing next to. So I'm like, you know, no matter what their chest has, they didn't come through the GWAT at the same time I did, you know? So so I find myself asking them hard questions, and typically what you hear is that, well, we didn't lose in Afghanistan. It was like the brass that fucked us, or it was like the politicians that fucked us.
Right.
You know, because they can't onboard that somewhere, I call it the blood-brain barrier, somewhere between the decision maker, the civilian decision makers, right? We serve the civilian policymakers as a military until we have a coup, right? A military coup at least. Somewhere between the civilian decision makers and our senior officer class, our senior enlisted class, there is a breakdown, which people like to compartmentalize out of the military. They're essentially, what they say is like, if your entire general officer class is corrupt, which is essentially my assessment.
Yep.
Well, that doesn't reflect poorly on us down here at the tactical level. And I'm like, hey man, you can't cherry pick the dysfunctional parts of the military out of the military, especially when it's basically your entire command structure. And then for the enlisted dudes who you just want to play the blame game, like, hey man, next to every single general officer, to include Miley, all these fucking losers, is a senior enlisted guy. There's an E9 standing next to all of them. And so, like, where was that guy?
Yeah.
Where were any of these people that spoke up? So, and I guess this kind of bleeds over into a part of the next other conversation of people being offered to rejoin this military. I mean, the corruption is systemic at the highest levels. And I guess we're only a few days or a couple of weeks into this new administration, and they seem to be taking a hatchet to a lot of things. Whether or not that's going to be good or bad is yet to be seen. But, I guess how do these people address that portion of the failing of the military? I might have got off on a tangent there.
No, yeah, it's a great question, because people are probably looking for justifications to reinforce what they already believe. There's some confirmation bias, that is going on in people's minds. And listen, I understand that. Some of that is human nature. We all do that to some extent. But there comes a time where you have to realize that, okay, if I have a certain worldview, first of all, I got to understand what my own worldview is. And this is one of those things that's just kind of like a maturation process that you go through as a person, because well, and you may not necessarily have this conversation with yourself in exactly these words, but a lot of people at least understand, hey, I got to kind of figure out what I believe or who I am as a person, and that's kind of a process I guess you never really complete. I mean, you're always kind of going through that process, but when you're a young adult, you're really kind of grappling with who you are, right? So that's about the time that people come into the military too. You're leaving home, and mom and dad who hopefully gave you some sort of structure, in your life, and now you're here, now you're doing this, and you're trying to figure out how you assimilate what you see into your worldview. So a lot of times what happens is you got this set of beliefs, right? Or the way that you look at the world. And then you realize, hey, my worldview, for whatever reason, can't help me account for some of the things that I'm seeing in reality.
Yeah.
So now I have a choice. I can either kind of refine my worldview, right? And say, hey, you know what? Maybe I've kind of been thinking this way. Maybe that's not exactly right. Maybe it's more like this, or you can just kind of ignore what you see or interpret what you see in a way that may not necessarily be accurate, but it kind of concurs with your worldview. And a lot of people do that, trying to protect their own belief system, etc. But, you bring up another good point, and we can go there because all this stuff is kind of tied in, right? So, yeah. So right now, we're into February, a week or so, into February. So we're still not even a month into the Trump administration. But here's what we do know. So Trump had made a couple of statements before he even came into the Oval Office, before inauguration, in which he said, hey, I'm going to offer reinstatement and back pay for those who were, forced out of the military because of the COVID shot mandate. And then on January 20th, in his inauguration speech, he says, hey, I am going to reinstate those who were unjustly expelled. I think that's the term he used, unjustly expelled. And then a week later, we see the exact the wording. The actual executive order is published, so we can go through. We can look at the wording, and there are some things in there that I thought were good, and then I felt like there are a lot of things that are missing. So when you read that executive order, you look in section 1 and it characterizes the executive order as unfair. Well, I agree with that. Overbroad. And then it also calls it a completely unnecessary burden on service members. And then it refers to the need for federal redress for the wrongful dismissals that occurred. So I agree with it being, unfair and overbroad, a completely unnecessary burden. I agree with the wrongful dismissals piece. I do think, though, that it was a significant omission to not call the mandate unlawful. Now, I firmly believe that the whole COVID op was treason. I think there are many, many, many other reasons for that. But even if we just look at it narrowly, just the mandate itself, just, almost in a vacuum, independent of that other stuff, that's fine. But the mandate itself and the implementation plan for the mandate, the way in which it was carried out, was unequivocally unlawful. There's no gray area. There might have been when this thing first came out. I understand they went to great lengths to lie. I understand how people could perhaps have been duped in the beginning. But 3.5 years later, there are so many questions, so many red flags. The bullshit card has been thrown so many times by so many people. It is now impossible to claim ignorance as to the legal problems with the COVID shot mandate. So I think that was a big miss. In fact, I think it was deliberate that the word unlawful, or illegal, that was not used in that section. And then it goes on and it talks about, it does mention back pay. It mentions that you have to request to be reinstated. So now there's so what you got to apply. So you have to be approved.
I gotta go to MEPS.
Yeah. So because this, I actually think this is an interesting question, because so if you have to apply, whatever that means, right? Well, can you be disapproved? Can you be disapproved for reinstatement? Do you have to sign a new contract? Are they going to try and make it excessively bureaucratic for you to get back in, to where most people are just going to say, listen, I want the back pay. Yeah, I think I was wronged, but I'm not going through this,
That would make sense to me as a smokescreen, right? They're like, hey, it's like some of these January 6 folks that are getting released and then immediately re-arrested on a different charge. Right. So it's almost like, well, hey, we offered everybody a chance to come back in. It just turned out that, only, 1% of the people were able to fit through the eye of whatever needle that they designed. Right. So it's because the reality is, I don't assess that they want a wave of people that had the moral fortitude to say no coming back into the military, because how does that even work? So let's just say as a discussion point, I come back in, right? Mm-hmm. They wave the wand and I'm Chief Warrant Officer Anderson again. Well, I'm going to end up in meetings with people that I saw lie to their fucking Marines, that, coerce them. I'm going to be in meetings with people who bent the fucking knee. And okay, so now I'm back in the rank structure. Now I got to pretend like General Schmuckatelli, who went along with it, who signed everything, who put everything on the walls of the building, all the COVID propaganda. He's still walking around. Like I still have to, and it's even worse, really, if you're playing heads up ball, because you're dealing with the same people that lost Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. There's literally been zero accountability within the military, and when I bring these things up at work, nobody wants to talk about it at all. And if they do talk about it, they definitely don't want to talk about the vaccine thing.
Yep.
But if they do talk about the Afghanistan thing, it rotates back to like, oh, well, all these people fucked us. And it kind of leads back to that Geopolitics 101 thing. So, I think about this a lot. And what I've come down to is, I think the reason why people don't want to open their aperture to that, to the realities of the deep state. And to me, the deep state isn't the functionaries that do this nonsense. To me, the deep state is the black nobility, pharaonic families, any family that's ever had a pope in their lineage, we're talking about those type of people as the deep state. The reason why people don't want to open their aperture to accept that as part of their reality is, if you were a true and honest man and you're confronted with that injustice, you must do something about it. Mm-hmm. Or you cannot count yourself amongst like the true and honest men. action has to be taken or a portion of your soul dies. If you just sit around and do nothing, once you've discovered these things, and then you go back like, oh, I'm an upright person. No, you're not, because you know it deep down inside, and the rest of us know it. So I mean, how do you feel about that?
Yeah. Those are some great points. So what's going on with this executive order? Just to start there, and then come back to some of the other things that you said that tie in. So, is this an intent to make a wrong right, or is this is the intent just to create the illusion that they're doing that? So a way to put this, is this something real that you're actually seeing, or are they just creating the shadow on the wall, to go back to the allegory of the cave, right?
Yeah.
Is that what they're doing? Because unfortunately, for many Americans, the shadow on the wall is enough, because they will mistake that for the real thing. So unfortunately for Americans, creating the illusion of something is enough. And, I think what we're seeing right now is a massive illusion. I think that if there are two things that I think that we're going to see in the Trump administration, now I think they're going to give us plenty of illusions, and they're going to give you plenty of so-called reasons to clap and cheerlead what's going on. But I think in the background, my assessment is two major things are going to happen. One is they're going to bring about kind of new features of the control grid. This is kind of where I think Elon comes in.
Yeah.
And then I also think they're going to set the stage for war. And so in the back of my mind, I'm kind of wondering if some of this, at least pretending to care about the military and to kind of right the wrongs in the military, is to get more people to say, hey, rah, rah, I want to go back into the military again. And I think some of that is why they put this guy in as the Secretary of Defense. Because if you look at the old guard, like you said, everybody wants to point to the generals, everybody wants to point to, the old SecDef. So if you can get rid of the old guard and what that old guard represents, and then you bring in like a young guy who's not a retired general, who, you can get people to think like, oh, this is going to be a completely different military. And I think some people are starting to think that. It's like, okay, but is it really going to be that different?
Yeah, I think you're right with the pageantry of who they're selecting. People get super happy about Tulsi Gabbard, and I have to remind people like, hey, Tulsi was in the running for president when Trump, was beat by Biden. Like, Tulsi had to bow out for Biden to be the guy. She bowed out last, but she bowed out. And so it's like, how can you, if you really cared about the country that much, why wouldn't you see it all the way through? Why wouldn't you run until you failed? Why wouldn't you run the entire competition, and at the end be like, okay, I was beaten fair and square in open competition? Why would you let this retard Biden like in? It's
You also mentioned the Afghanistan withdrawal. So, not a lot of talk about the Afghanistan withdrawal right now, but what are we hearing about? We're hearing about DEI. So that kind of seems to be it kind of seems to be this, a controlled disclosure, kind of this limited hangout. Hey, I'm going to put this out there to draw everyone's attention, and we're going to knock that down. And then everyone's going to be like, oh, Trump and Hegseth are fixing our military,
Yeah, it's knocking down like straw man. It's knocking down like false targets. It's knocking down things that, DEI didn't have any effect on us losing Afghanistan. That's just like it's like a smokescreen. It's like,
yeah, I think so. Do I think DEI is ridiculous? Of course it's ridiculous. Of course. But when you take DEI and you compare it to the Afghanistan withdrawal, or you compare it to the COVID shot mandate, they're not even the same realm,
they're all but they all build on each other, because that was all essentially within the same 4 to 5 year period.
Of course, yeah.
And the majority of it has to be something like 90% of the leadership of the military that was the leadership of the military during that period of time.
That's right.
Still the leadership of the military.
Yes.
Like, it's you can go to the command board at the quarter deck and look at these people. You're like, okay, well, that dude was in CENTCOM during this time, and now he's the fucking like WARCOM guy, and you're like, this, like, in my estimation, to even just begin to get the military right, you would have to fire everybody down to like the 06s. And that's not to say that the 06s aren't compromised as well, because they're like in the chute to go into the star selection, you know, but that might at the very least show people like, hey, you know, maybe it's not worth it to pursue my own personal greed or my own personal gain, because they just fired all of these generals. I mean, I think we had during World War II something like maybe 7-ish 4-star generals or something like that. It was a ridiculous, it was an appropriately small number. It wasn't a ridiculously small number.
Right.
Like the number of these bureaucrats that we have now is the ridiculous size.
That's right. That's right. We have a much, you know, I can't remember the size of the force during World War II, but it was enormous. And you're right.
Yeah.
There was a much smaller number of that kind of cadre of generals and admirals. So right now, and I'm not sure how much of you guys' audience is not military. I'm assuming a lot of it is, but you know,
probably 70%, I would guess.
Okay. So for those who are listening that may not necessarily know these numbers, so we have about 1.3 to 1.4 million active troops across all service branches. You add in the entire reserve side, it takes you over a little bit over 2 million, just to give people an idea of what the size of our force is right now. So how many generals and admirals do we have? So we maintain about 600 billets. This is just on the active duty side. So 1.3 to 1.4 million active duty, you know, troops of all service branches. We maintain billets for about 600 generals and admirals, 1 to 4-star. Now, sometimes that the number of the actual guys may be a little bit different, but we maintain about 600 billets across all the service branches. So if you take those 600 guys, whoever they are, that are currently serving on active duty right now, 1 to 4-star, whatever service branch, every single one of those guys that is currently serving right now was a part of the COVID shot mandate.
Yep.
You know, they may or may not have been directly involved in what happened in, you know, in Afghanistan or whatever, but they all went along with the DEI initiatives. I mean, certainly none of them spoke out publicly against the DEI initiatives. They wouldn't still be serving today. None of those guys spoke out publicly about what was happening with the COVID shot mandate, because they wouldn't be currently serving today. So every single one of those, with zero exceptions, went along with those initiatives that you were just talking about over the last kind of, you know, 5 years, these massive screw ups that we've had.
And to back it up a little bit further back, I was so at MARSOC. This had been like 2015-ish. I was friendly with a doctor from the Center for Naval Analysis, CNA, because she was friends with the major at MARSOC I was dating. So she was involved in a test, and I'm sorry, not a test, research, and you know, Center for Naval Analysis. And what her research project was they went out to 29 Palms, and they did this with like a portion of somebody that was going on a MEU or something. Anyway, long story short, they had a unit that was made up of 3 platoons. One platoon was all dudes. One platoon was a mixed platoon of dudes and women. And one platoon was all women. So they take them out to 29 Palms, to the Combined Arms Exercise Center out there, and do CACs. I'm probably getting a lot of these acronyms and words wrong at this point. And they do a study. And it's like, okay, you don't have to be a wizard to figure out how this study turned out.
Yeah.
The all male platoon won every single event. You know, the mixed platoon came in second in every single event, and the female platoon came in last in every single event. And it's, you know, in my brain, I'm like, we needed however much money this study took to figure out that was going to that was going to turn out that way.
Right.
So, you know, even back as far as like 2015, they were playing with this nonsense that, to an honest person who has an honest relationship with reality, can see that 190 pound 5'10" dude is more advantageous than 110 pound chick with her Kevlar cack to the side, and I can only see like a small set of legs underneath the pack. We've all seen these people. I'm not trying to use pejoratives on folks, but it's ridiculous, you know? So it's I don't see any accountability coming for that group of folks.
Mm-hmm.
And so how does that play out?
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is why sometimes I ask myself, and these are the things that people who kind of in the military accountability circles that I run in, and I've done a lot of work with them over the last 2.5 years since I got out of the military. But where I, to some degree, have differences of opinions with those individuals, and they're all great people. Don't get me wrong; they're great people trying to do the right thing.
From the Geopolitics 101 standpoint, they are good people.
Yes. But the overwhelming majority of them are locked inside that Geopolitics 101 framework, which means they don't necessarily see that, hey, there are bigger issues at play, and there are things that you may be looking at that you think are victories that are either just facades, or perhaps they're even, stage setting events for something, or a trap that's being laid, on down the line. Because I think there are a lot of things right now that are being presented to us as victories that are really just they're a lure that is out there to kind of, bring you in. So, and that's where I think people have to be very, very careful about that. But you mentioned, you kind of mentioned the black nobility earlier. So everyone's familiar and has been since Trump's first administration with this term, kind of the deep state. And I talk about this in that Geopolitics 101 video. And I also talk about how there's a book that I really like. It is the author Parag Khanna. I mean, he is a globalist, so it's not that I agree with everything that he says.
Well, Quigley's a globalist.
Yes. But there are things that you can read in those texts that you can still, glean truth from, or at least an understanding of this is the globalist narrative. So whenever I hear things reinforcing this narrative, I need to know, like, okay, that's the direction that they want us to head in, or whatever. But anyway, so he says in the preface to the book, and of course I went over this in Geopolitics 101, but he says, hey, to understand international relations, blah, 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 you got to think like a country. So I take that and I kind of expand upon it in two ways. One, well, okay, yeah, but think like the deep state of a country. But then also the second step is kind of internationalize that idea, and now think like the deep empire, this deep-seated empire that has kind of had its tentacles across the the globe for a long time, kind of out across the world for who knows how long.
I tend to shy away from stuff these days that leads towards the fantastic. I don't go down the rabbit hole of reptiles and aliens and all this other nonsense, because I think that is smokescreen for what is more logical and far more sinister, which is simply that mankind in antiquity, the concepts of rulership are ancient, and the techniques in which you would accomplish that are also ancient and evolving, right? A lot of people from their own comfort zone like to assess that what is going on is incompetency, right? Like it's, oh, well, the government's just incompetent, or the military is just incompetent. Well, incompetency at a certain level is corruption, right? Like because if the mythology is a meritocracy, and you look at the people who are allegedly in charge, but they're not in charge, they're just the graphic user interface between us and power. I think it was that same book that you mentioned that said, the connection between power and space. Yeah. The connection between power and space is that fake user interface of your politicians, of your, of the structures. So outside of anything fantastic, I think what has potentially occurred is, in between these alleged falls of empires, there's a continuity of people who never get reset. So like when the pharaohs, when it switches over from Egypt to the Romans, there's no break at a certain level of society, and it's almost an analogy for being a reptile, because you shed your skin. You're like, yeah, okay, I was calling myself this. After a certain while, humanity, the soul of humanity, gets hip to what I'm doing. So I simply shed my skin. I'm no longer a pharaoh. Now I'm a Caesar. Oh, now I'm no longer a Caesar. Now I'm a president. Well, now I'm no longer a president. Now I'm a CEO. And behind all of those things is the actual steerage of power.
Sure.
Now, what their end state is and what their overall motivation is, I feel is probably from an alchemical standpoint. They're attempting to complete what they envision as the great work, which is
right.
From my assessment, you've got a couple different folks. You've got the purely atheistic folks that think that this is all some sort of reticulate existence, just matter. And so from that gives them the authority to operate in any way they see fit. I think there's another group of people whose philosophy is perhaps that this place is a type of prison. And so they've stumbled to the technology of, well, better to extend my life here in this prison rather than pay the ultimate consequence of my death and reintegration with source, which is the signal and the noise of all ancient wisdom, is you pay the price for your actions here, whether that's Christianity, whether that's Islam, whether that's, Hinduism, is that this place is some sort of a test, so that these people have essentially used these constructs of different countries to build the machinery that's going to require to keep them alive for fucking ever, and then just pull the plug. This is what's good and bad about this show is you can go in any direction you want, but that's essentially.
I like it. I like it. And so
did I leave anything out? Did I mess anything up? What do you?
No, that was great. That was great. So but it's important for people to understand that this is. And this is, where you lose people if they're kind of inside that Geopolitics 101 framework, right? But this stuff is important because this is exactly what is happening, So even right now, some of the language that we're hearing from the administration that then is repeated in the media, right? Just the golden age, just to use
the golden age,
right? But that language is meant to be interpreted, in a variety of different levels. So when you mention there are alchemical objectives that these leaders have, or, there are connotations with that specific term, the golden age, there are alchemical connotations. There are, Saturnian, connotations to that, etc. And those things are intended, but they're intended for those who understand what is being communicated, because 95% of people, they just think of like, oh yeah, like a golden age, like, yeah, it's going to be a happy, prosperous time. And they don't think anything beyond that. But there are layered messages that are being communicated for, those who can hear it. So, but if we don't understand that that's what's actually happening, then how can we necessarily prepare to engage in, this other term that you and I were talking about before we came on, but kind of this deep war that I think that we're in.
Yeah. And for people who shy away from the Saturnian, the occult, or even the idea that there are groups of people that did not get rid of their old religions, they just renamed it. And this is, I like to go with ideas that there's proof of in antiquity. So for example, multiple gods were called a same god was called multiple things in antiquity. So Saturn was also El, which was also Kronos. It's and so I think it's naive to think that like, oh, Christianity came along and all these people just stopped doing that. And you're like, why would they do that? It's not
right.
It's but back onto the occultism aspect of it. So for people that smoke the hopium of Donald Trump, I like to point out, and this is from our Instagram page, how Trump was bailed out by the Rothschilds in the 90s. His casinos are failing, and this is just a quick little thing. I actually grabbed this from an article and just ran it through an AI voice and just threw it on some things. So I'll just hit play on this real quick, and it should be, hopefully all the volume and everything's correct.
investing in faltering businesses like steel mills and coal mines, finding a fortune in blue-collar industries that others dismissed as beyond saving. But before he was scooping up Rust Belt factories, the banker was sizing up another troubled asset: Donald Trump. More than 2 decades ago, Ross represented bondholders who were gunning for Trump after he failed to pay back the high-interest loans he had taken out to build his casino empire. When Ross arrived in Atlantic City for negotiations in 1990, he found a throng of journalists and curious onlookers eager to catch a glimpse of Trump. For the quiet Ross, the scene inspired a revelation. Trump's flashy image had resilience. The future president at one time owned a quarter of Atlantic City's casino market. But Trump was heavily in debt, and he started missing bond payments on his largest casino, the Taj Mahal, in 1990. Ross, then an investment banker working for Rothschild Inc., helped bondholders negotiate with Trump, whose finances were unraveling. The final deal reduced Trump's ownership stake in the Taj, but left him in charge, and bondholders were unhappy when Ross presented the plan. Ross grew up in New Jersey and attended a Jesuit prep school in New York before earning degrees from Yale and the Harvard Business School. He spent 2 decades at Rothschild working on bankruptcies before starting his own private equity firm, W.L. Ross & Co. in 2000. A Palm Beach, Florida, resident who owns an art collection valued at 9 figures and is worth an estimated $2.5 billion according to Forbes. Ross earned a reputation as a so-called vulture investor for finding profits in dying businesses. Ross described himself differently in an interview with New York Magazine. "We're a phoenix that rebuilds itself from the ashes."
So that's basically it. And so the occult portion of that is the phoenix that rebuilds itself from the ashes.
Mm-hmm.
Stop sharing that. You know, there's several interesting parts in that. So later on, when Trump finally got elected president, he made Wilbur Ross the Secretary of Commerce. And that's how these type of things play out. You know, it's always funny to me that, you know, Trump was going broke on a casino. It's like, bro, how do you go broke on a casino? What'd you forget to steal? You know, like what? How does that even work? I'm like frozen on one half. That's kind of weird. But so it's almost like the controlled demolition of America is being overseen, and in order to build it back, so you burn it down to the ashes, and then you build it back into the thing you want, which is the occult symbolism of the phoenix. You know, so. Yeah, that's basically what I have for that.
Yeah, and that's, you know, that's insightful stuff there. Who, you know, I have a lot of friends of mine who, they're either, I would say they're either Trump fans or they want to believe, you know.
Yeah.
They because they can't fathom it being any other way. So they're kind of unprepared. So, you know, and I guess my response to that is, we are in the midst of a war. We've been in the midst of a war for a long time, but we have to expand our understanding of what it means to be in a war.
Yeah.
You know, war is not just guns, tanks, bombs, explosions. There's more to it than that. And it's important that we understand that, because like you and I were talking about just before we started, but we're all combatants in this war. So you may think you're not a combatant, but here's the deal. Your enemy views you as a combatant, which means they view you as a legitimate target. And they have no problem stealing your food supply, giving you, you know, fake medication, pumping your children's minds full of, you know, just indoctrinated ideas about this or that or whatever, you know, a false sense of reality. And so you just got to understand that, you know, we're all in the midst of this war, whether we want to believe that or not.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, and that's probably the good thing that we switched over to that is, you know, that goes into deep war. And one of the gentlemen that talks a lot about this subject is a guy named Mark Passio. You ever stumble upon Mark Passio's work? I like Mark Passio because coming from the Marine Corps, I like things to just be told to me in brutally honest fashion. It's like and Mark, Mark can be kind of hard to listen to sometimes if you're already on the same page as he is, because he'll spend about 20, 30, 45 minutes berating people that are already listening to him. It's like, bro, we're already listening. We're already on the same machine of music. Like, just get back to the part where like the occultists are running this thing. But so I guess the initial stage of coming to this information is you want to share it with people, and you want to, you want to wake the normies up, and because we all have people we love that are normies, we have friends, family, you show them this information. And I think, like we've talked about earlier before, like one of the reasons why they don't onboard it is because, okay, well, how, so what you're saying is the guy I voted for isn't even in charge. What you're saying is there is a cryptocracy that I can't affect in any way, shape, or form. I can't vote for him. I can't do anything like this. And so how can I even begin to fight back toward this? And this does lead itself to deep war. And so one of the things that I think about with this a lot is you can't really make groups, because you're going to get targeted, you're going to get infiltrated, you're going to get, labeled as some sort of a group. And so it really is an individual effort thing. Like my idea of deep war against the deep state, which is the, call it what you want, Luciferian nobility, is one of siege warfare. I mean, they are conducting siege warfare against us. They haven't said it like that, even though they have in a lot of their documentation, a lot of their books, a lot of their writings are simply, you mentioned the Council 300 in the last video. I mean, they're describing siege warfare across centuries, And so what I'm proposing is open siege warfare against them. That's going to take centuries. And nobody really wants to hear that. Like the Taliban beat us with open comms. I would literally be listening. Well, not me. The Terp is listening to the Taliban's communication. They're like, yep, they see the trucks. Yep, they're getting in position. Yep, they're going to attack us. Yep, they're going to fire the rocket at the first vehicle. So we radio up to the first vehicle like, hey, man, you might want to get in defilade. These boys sound serious.
Yeah.
And sure as shit, here comes the rockets. Here comes the machine guns. Like they didn't care that we were listening. They didn't care that they're like, yeah, okay, so what? We know that you know that we know that you know, right? So it's it's one of those things, so where you build a community, but you maintain individualized. Aaron and I were talking about it during our last episode, where it would be a lot simpler if there was a single small set of laws that every person was individually responsible for upholding. But with moral relativism, that can't really be the case. I mean, how do you see an effective way to move forward, having accepted the paradigm that they're of the cryptocracy? Like, what would be your way to move forward against this thing, which is clearly against humanity?
Yeah. Because a lot of people they say, hey, and sometimes they smugly ask, and people are like, oh, well, what's your solution? And regardless of how smugly they ask the question, it's still a valid question. It's still a valid question. So, but it goes back to, well, hey, the first thing we got to understand is to figure out a solution, you got to properly and appropriately understand the scope of the problem. And a lot of people still aren't there yet. And so the way I kind of talk about that is, the fastest way to lose a war is to realize too late that you're in one.
Yeah.
And so just a very like kind of bare bones way to understand that idea is if you're walking down the street and someone is walking towards you and you think they're just going to walk right past you, but in reality, they sucker punch you and now you're laid out on the ground. Well, what happened? That guy knew that the two of you were in a fight. You didn't know that the two of you were in a fight until it's too late. So, the fastest way to lose a war is to realize too late that you're in one.
Yeah.
Okay? So we have to realize that we are in a war. We are all combatants. That's the way the enemy looks at us. We're all legitimate targets. Okay, great. We're in a war. Well, what what is the essence of this war, because it's going to look different than other wars. This kind of goes into kind of that idea of deep war. And there are people who talk about, spiritual warfare, and people have talked about this for a very, very long time. And I think that's appropriate. I think that's very, very true. I do think, though, that many of us use that terminology metaphorically, and I think that's wrong. And I think I also used to use that term as a metaphor. But when you're using it metaphorically, it's as if you don't actually believe that it's war. That's my problem with using it metaphorically. No, spiritual warfare is warfare.
Yeah,
it's not a metaphor. Like, it is warfare. So anyway, so it's understanding that, and then it's realizing, okay, if they are going to kind of prosecute this war against us across these various modalities, or in these various domains, then we just have to understand that, all right, well, we've got to protect ourselves in those domains. And then also, are there ways in which we can kind of mitigate the effects of their attacks? So one of those, of course, is the spiritual side, which a lot of people neglect. So you mentioned, Mark Passio or others, but there are plenty of people out there who have talked for a long time about, their use of symbols, their use of encoded language. You mentioned cryptocracy. Cryptocracy is a term that researcher Michael Hoffman has used for a long time.
I'm a big Michael Hoffman fan. Yeah.
Yeah. He's got that idea of, twilight language.
Yep. Good book.
Yeah, I've got it right here somewhere. But there are people who've been talking about this for a long time, and more people need to understand that this war is, in my words, it is deeper than most people want to understand. And so it's not just trying to attack your body. It's trying to attack, deeper than that. And it's not just trying to attack your mind or your psyche, like the concept of psychological warfare. It's even one step deeper than that. I mean, it is attacking, your soul, if you want to look at it that way. There's an old German term that is called Weltanschauungskrieg. I don't speak German, so that's my best go with that.
Sounded good to me.
But the term, we kind of look at it, we kind of use that term, and then a lot of times it would get translated as psychological operations or psychological warfare. But more specifically, that term more directly translated is actually worldview warfare. And I like that term. I really like that term. I think that's a better, more descriptive term to kind of encompass the situation that we're actually in, because they are trying to attack not just what you do, but what you fundamentally believe, and the way in which you fundamentally approach, reality, or the way in which you see kind of your role in the world. So first is understanding that, so that we at least understand that their avenue of approach is it's deeper. And I know I keep using that term, but the reason I'm using that is because it's important for us to understand it's going to come at us in ways that the majority of people are not readily going to see, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, they are the masters of multidiscipline, full spectrum, holistic, whatever buzzwords you want to use that we try to use in our military operations. They are actually the masters of it.
Yes.
Like I never call them stupid. I never doubt their discipline. It is, a lot of people, flippantly, I mean, these people have kept money and wealth and power for potentially thousands of years. I mean, it's the most insidious enemy of humanity outside of something actually in a spiritual realm or something past that.
Yeah.
And I think the people, so, like you just said, codifying that into what it is, it's not just bombs and bullets. It's fluoride and fucking, and public schools, right? It is, I think the next hurdle for people to get over is that what they'll say is like, well, what are you going to do? Go fight them or something? Like the next thing is the silliness of hyperbole. They'll come to like some sort of reducto ad absurdum solution that that nobody's going to use, right? So it's essentially what I'm stating is, from a siege warfare standpoint, is one of the things I've said all the time is when I became aware of these things, I looked at it as I'm being ambushed. I was not aware. I was moving my life this direction, right? And I looked up during COVID and like found out that I was on the X. And when I looked up, I'm sure it's similar in the Army and the Marines. You know, when you realize you're on the X from a numerically superior foe, you break contact.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's the stage of the operation that I'm in right now, is the break contact phase, which is, well, shit, you know, I thought I was just going to be able to go through this world on training wheels. I thought it didn't matter where my water came from. I thought it didn't matter where my food came from. You know, so I was energy dependent. I still am trying to get off grid now, but it was, what I've been working on is like a meticulous dismantling of my dependence on a system that they control and own entirely. And with the idea that if enough of us start to do this, and it doesn't have to be moved to a farm, it can just be within your own existence, start to decouple yourself, you know, from their, they basically provide everything in society from one stage or another. Right.
Yeah.
And I think another thing people say when you discuss a situation like that, or a course of action like that, is how hard it's going to be. And the answer is yes. It's going to be the most difficult thing any of us do, because whenever I kind of feel down about, man, fuck, I wish I'd make more progress, you know, I always kind of remind myself like, well, hey, look, you know, I figure I've been kind of hip to the game, like on a full-time hipness. Like, I always thought shit was kind of weird, but you know, probably 2019, I was like full blown, like, which is why I didn't fall for the COVID shit, because I was already digging down, you know. You know, I think to myself, like, man, I wish I haven't made more progress, etc. But then I remind myself, like, yeah, it took me 30 years to 30 some odd years to dig myself this deep into their trap. So then when you finally look up and you're like, oh, I got to get out, you realize you're way behind enemy lines.
Sure.
You know, so I guess that the point to that is to reassure people that, you know, we're all stuck behind enemy lines. And the first step is going to be to start to decouple from what they're siphoning off of us. Stop eating their food, stop drinking their water, stop listening to their bullshit, you know. And, you know, at least a step one, man. Would you add anything to that? I mean,
yeah. So a couple things. So, you know, I had already been looking into this stuff for over a decade before the COVID narrative started being propagated out there, which is why I also was super skeptical, never believed the COVID narrative, you know, from day one. Yeah. I'm not saying I knew exactly what was going on, but I knew they were lying. Like from day
I knew
one,
they were lying about that.
Lying. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So then, you know, when they start, you know, so a year later, when they start talking about these shots are going to be rolled out, I'm like, okay, so that's one of the reasons that this was all, you know, this whole op was set up. So, you know, you mentioned an ambush, and I've been thinking about this in these terms for a long time. So, you know, think about I'll come back to the ambush point, but, you know, think about your, like a science experiment. Okay. So these people that we're talking about, the cryptocracy or whatever you want to call them, you know, this deep empire. So they know, and for those who are listening who are familiar with like organizations like the Tavistock Institute or whatever, but they collect so much data nowadays. They know human beings better than we know ourselves. So they know they can introduce a stimulus into the system to elicit a certain response. Like, I mean, they know that. They know that if they provide us with this stimulus through this event or through, you know, the propagation of some narrative in the media, they know that the public is going to react in this way. And they can steer us to go into the direction that they want us to go, or at least, you know, the majority of the population, right? So, you know, kind of the idea of like a complex ambush, you know, you'll have those who are sighting in the ambush, you know, they'll have their battle positions. They may have primary and alternate or even supplementary battle positions, but a lot of times the success of the ambush is predicated upon being able to predict the initial response of the force that is coming through in the ambush. Because when they initially respond to the ambush, they may actually maneuver themselves into the intended, kill zone, etc. And so the success of the ambush is those who are sighting it in. Once we initiate the ambush, we know that this force is then probably going to react in this way because we know their doctrine, we know their TTPs, we know the way that they're going to react to the terrain, and then they'll probably move this way, and that's actually going to be, the kill zone. So I just use that kind of as an analogy to they are not incompetent. You mentioned incompetence before, and I completely agree with you that they are not incompetent. I don't call them stupid. I hear other people call them stupid. They're not stupid. They may be diabolical. They may be like
evil. They're not stupid,
like mad geniuses. But they're not stupid. They're not stupid. But they can use kind of that middle management layer of bureaucrats, apparatchiks, to use that old term, to kind of create like a veil of incompetence. But they're beyond that. That's just the bureaucrats that they put in between us and them, kind of that smokescreen that we were talking about before. So when it comes to the way in which they can provide a stimulus to the system and elicit a response, or kind of that, that complex ambush, what that means for us is that, hey, you gotta be acutely aware of what's going on. The old, keep your head on a swivel, but also don't overreact to a stimulus that is provided. So when you first see an event, a person, a political party, a narrative, whatever it is, but when there is a stimulus that is put out there, what I try to tell people to do is don't follow that very human tendency to immediately either reject or accept what you've just seen. You don't have to make that determination immediately most of the time. You can kind of wait. You can wait for further evidence to kind of come and either corroborate or be in conflict with what with what has just come out there. But we have so many people who just react dialectically. Something happens, or there's a person that is put out there, or there's an event that happens, and everyone falls into the camp of, I totally accept that, or I totally reject that. And then they're constantly fighting. And a lot of times those are just dialectical traps that are seeded out there specifically to divide people into two camps that are focused on each other, in terms of being focused on those who are actually setting the traps.
Yeah, man. It started to break up there a little bit at the end, but yeah, I was tracking everything. Yeah, their concepts of operation are brilliant, and it's almost like the house always wins. Like it's, you don't want to go to war overseas? Okay, fine. Well, we'll just import a war here to you. Like you don't want to go fight in an overseas war? Okay, not a big deal. We'll go ahead and we'll dump, 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 20 million people directly in your backyard. So it's like, the money siphoned to the military industrial complex will not stop, because both prongs of those, like say for example, they were to bring in a like a Monroe Doctrine type guy. It's like, hey, we're all going to just peel back and be here in America and just take care of our own thing. It's like, okay, well, in your own thing now are almost as many terrorists as you fucking killed overseas. Like we just let them come into your backyard. It's like right. It's very interesting, man.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, man. It's been about an hour, and I got to catch up on some farm stuff, man. But I love this conversation, man, and I'd love to have another one again to just keep kind of like flushing this out, because I think that's one of the people that, or I think that's one of the things that people have the biggest problem with when they hear stuff like this. And I was telling a buddy from the Hard to Kill podcast that like, we want to bring people truth, but our truth is extremely ugly on the front side.
It is, yes.
And I think this part of the conversation is important to keep flushing out, because they're like, well, if I believe you, I wake up into a nightmare.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you're like, well, yes and no. Yes, there are some nightmarish parts about how things are going down right now, but what I would really like to focus on, at least 2025 and moving forward, is what is the new paradigm? And let's start, because I always hated, I mean, that's the reason why I became a chief warrant officer, is like I always hated bitching about something that you couldn't do anything about. And I thought, well, okay, well, maybe if I become an officer, I could do something about it. Like, I'm more interested in the solution at this point than the problem. And I think we can get people to look at the problem from a deep standpoint if we have solutions that can help, you know. So it's not like, hey, here's a black pill. Welcome aboard. You know what I'm saying? At least we won't be by ourselves when this whole thing goes down, you know.
That's right.
Yeah, man.
And that is a huge challenge, you know. And the one thing that I'll say, and I know we're getting ready to wrap up here, but I think one of the most important things that we can do when it comes to solutions, and I say this, and I think sometimes people think it's a little bit too abstract, but I do think it's incredibly important. One of the reasons it's necessary to understand this stuff is because of the concept of what I call consent farming. And these, you know, there's kind of this occult idea of the power of consent. You know, you want to perform a ritual. You got to understand that the way these people look at this stuff, you know, they're performing their operations. There's a ritualistic nature to their operations they're performing, right? And so when their intended
100%.
when the intended target consents to what is happening, then it becomes even more powerful. So what we've got to do is understand that, hey, you know, we're not consenting to what is being done. But in order to kind of refuse to give our consent, you know, refuse to comply, we have to understand what it is that they're asking us to do in order to be able to kind of, you know, negate our consent, if that makes sense, you know?
Yeah, man, 100%. Let's keep talking, and we'll keep building.
All right, brother.
Consent farming, or we'll just keep reinforcing the fact that we do not consent.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right, Brad. Good talking. I'm gonna hit stop. I'm gonna hit end recording, man. We'll wrap up really quick, and then we'll keep kicking it, man. All right, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Love y'all. We'll see Brad again.